So now I'm going to step back and spend maybe about 10 minutes talking about what an oyster is. Because I know there's a bunch of you people here who are no more than I about what an oyster is, but there's a bunch of others that would like to learn a little bit. And some of this is pretty pedantic. I am a teacher. And so I do want you to know that they're bivalve mollusks. I want you to know that they have a Latin name. That's the kind of the lowest of the low for a teacher to make you learn Crassostrea virginica. But there's a method to my madness. In a second, you'll see that knowing that our local oyster is called Crassostrea virginica will matter to you a little bit. I promise you in about 3 minutes. They live in marine and estuarine waters. They never get to salinities of much less than 5 PSU, practical salinity units, or parts per thousand as they're sometimes called. The valves are not symmetrical. The left valve cements down on the bottom. It's usually cup-shaped and much deeper than the right valve, which is much more flattened. And those of you who have seen oysters know that they kind of look like that, right? And when you eat them, they're on the half shell. They're on the left, on that left valve, which is deeper, and then you suck it up, right? How many of you have eaten raw oysters? Look at that. Why else would you be here? Otherwise you'd be watching the Yankee game or having a beer or something, right? And so you know these oysters live in reefs. Maybe I shouldn't really be talking about this if you may know all this stuff here. But here's something that's fun for me, and at any rate. It used to be that I asked people, why is there this R rule for oysters? That is, why is it that you're not supposed to eat oysters in months without an R? You all know that rule, right? Right, exactly. Have any of you ever read an article that says it's just a lot of crap? Yeah, right? In fact, one of the people who wrote an article about this, I came upon accidentally, was by a fellow named Laurie McHugh. Laurie McHugh was a faculty member at Stony Brook when it was called the Marine Sciences Research Center. He's a very famous man. He was a member, pretty much ran the International Whaling Commission for a while. But he used to be an ordinary federal employee, and he had to write these articles to while away the time every once in a while. And he wrote an article about how stupid it was to have this R rule. So I have found 6 reasons. I'm going to quickly go through them. 6 of them, okay? You ready? One comes from the 1600s in France. France is a major place where oysters are cultivated, and it's just a rule to just reduce the destruction of oyster beds, just to bring down the destruction in the summertime when people are out of doors. Pretty straightforward. Here's one that comes from New York, from the New York colony, and that is it's just a rule to keep oysters from being collected while they're spawning and reproducing. That makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah, it does. Here's another one. It's a rule to prevent oysters, to eat oysters when bacteria are in warm waters, because that's when you're going to get sick. Every once in a while you read an article, there are fewer and fewer because they've gotten better and better about enforcement, where 20 people in a restaurant, often an Italian restaurant in Nassau County, sorry, that's the way it is, suddenly had to get up and take a hike. And that happens in the summertime. And we know now that there are lots of places, some of you may have encountered these, places that are closed seasonally. They're closed in the summer, and they're open in the winter. Makes sense, too. Here's another one, which by the way, Laurie McHugh discusses in some detail, and that is that in the summertime, while the oysters are spawning, they spawn out their gametes, and they're really thin, and they're not very good to eat. And by the way, a major theme of the movie, this Australian movie, The Oyster Farmer, is that when they have the oysters in these pens, that overnight, before they're going to pack them, that they not spawn, because they suddenly lose all their weight. And this is a great calamity when this happens. So this is a reality to it, too. Laurie McHugh made fun of it, but he's wrong. He was wrong. It is real. And here's a 5th one, and this is also absolutely true, no longer a constraint. When oysters were collected, packed, and shipped, in the summertime, they didn't have refrigerators. And they shipped oysters from Chesapeake Bay by rail to San Francisco. There were raw bars in San Francisco where people ate Chesapeake Bay oysters. There were other railroads, the C&O, that brought stuff up the Ohio Valley. There were other railroads that brought things up to the Northeast. So Didn't want to do that in the summertime because there would be one of those Nassau County Italian restaurants that would have 20 people hopping their way out. And here's the last one, and this is the one that's kind of amusing, but it's absolutely true, but not if you're in America. And there are some people that have claimed that this is why all Americans obey the R rule, and it's a stupid reason. And that is that in Europe, the oyster that is cultivated, used to be cultivated mostly, is Ostreidae edulis. Ostreidae edulis has a real cool way of reproducing. They rear the young. The females get inseminated by gametes in the water. The young are kept in the cavity, what's called the mantle cavity, and they grow up for a while, and then they're finally released. If you ate an oyster like that, you'd feel this crunchiness as the little shells were there, and you also would have this delightful feeling of chewing on thousands of babies. And you're sitting there eating your oyster and you're chewing babies. Doesn't sound very good. And that's an absolute reason not to eat oysters, Ostreidae edulis. But Crassostrea virginica, remember the Latin, is a different species. Males and females both spawn out their gametes, no such problem, okay? That's another one people have said, you're stupid, you're obeying a European rule that's been transported to America. But I hope I've convinced you that, take your pick, who knows, okay? And here's Chris mentioned that I went to Yale. Here's one of the people, Yaleys, who must have been a disappointment to his parents because he had one of these names that's two last names, which an upstanding northeastern Protestant, Stoddard King, who became a songwriter, and that's one of the little ditties he wrote. He also wrote the famous song "O Abdullah" and "Tiddly Diddly Do," and one called "The Long and Winding Trail," I think it's called. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing it for you, but it was a very big hit. He made some money writing songs. He was a Yalie who ran the Yale Theater and a lot of other things. But it says how brave it is to eat them in May. So now I want to talk some of the basics: sex, food, and death. And the first thing I want to talk about are what in England they call the naughty bits, because the naughty bits turn out to be important. And here's something that some of you might not know about oysters. They change sex. They go from male to female. First they're immature when they settle out of the water. Then they become males. And then when they get larger, they become females. That's not guaranteed, but that's usually the trajectory of any oyster that is growing. It's first a male, then it's a female, as it gets larger and larger. And the question arises, you might be saying, why do that? Of course, I say, why do we do what we do? That actually seems kind of weird. You have to, why are we doing that? I don't know, but I can't tell you why oysters do it. There's an advantage. Those of you who have a partner of the opposite sex that you're sitting next to might immediately have thought about this at one time in your life, how males really are doing something that's really cheap. Sperm just doesn't cost very much energetically. There's not much investment at all to it. So the argument about this switch of sex is the so-called size advantage model. That is, when you're small, you'll have more young if you just spawn out sperm into the water column. But then as you get bigger and bigger, if you make eggs, well, eggs cost a lot. Females, just as you all know, females invest a lot more than males do in this very basic way. There are other things as well, but the eggs themselves are much more energy rich and require many more calories to make per egg. And as you get bigger and bigger, you lay out these eggs and you spawn them in the water, and they get fertilized. So then when you're bigger, that's when you become a female. So in other words, when it's smaller, it's cheaper to make sperm, but as you beget more offspring as you get larger if you turn into a female. And so the best strategy is to behave as small when you're as a male and female when large. Why all animals don't do this is beyond me, at least marine animals. It's because it's such a clever thing. There's two pictures of the male gonad and the female gonad. The female gonad has these big oocytes there on the left, and the right, that's just all a lot of sperm that you're looking at. And from the outside, you really don't know one from the other, but they do know each other. There's a fellow named Vic Kennedy who did this very, very clever experiment where he took a whole cage of female oysters, put them out in the water, and few months later, half of them turn into males. They know. Nobody knows the mechanism, but they can apparently smell each other and detect it. I know of a different group entirely that a student of mine worked on years ago. She set them up. These are worms that go from male to female. She set them up with all males and all females. Both populations went eventually to 50-50. So they can tell. And so sex reversal is possible. And the reason is quite simple. It's very easy to change the naughty bits from making female gametes to male gametes. That's not so easy for us. That is for mammals. That turns out to be quite difficult. During development, to become a male, to become a female, results in all sorts of commitments to morphology that makes us different, but not for oysters. And there's some oysters spawning, kind of reminds you of Krakatoa east of Java type of thing. They spawn into the water column, the gametes go into the water. Eventually there's fertilization, lots of sperm often competing with an egg. We don't know a lot about that, but we do know that there's very precise gamete recognition through proteins known as lysins, and I won't say any much more than that, but it's a protein that the sperm has that makes it very specific for a sperm to recognize the egg coat protein of the female of the same species. So even though often all these gametes are in the water column, they know, even the gametes know who is who. It's a chemical recognition system. It's not quite as romantic, perhaps, as we might imagine, but it works awful well. Then, after fertilization, there are larvae that are in the water. They are up in the water column. They are there for 2 or 3 weeks, and they don't swim very fast. Swim about 1 millimeter a second, which is hardly fast at all. They have this lovely structure called the ciliated velum, which moves them this very small speed. One of the vexing things is they don't look much like oysters when they're larvae. They look kind of like any old clam. It's hard to tell oysters in their early stages from any other bivalve larva. Pretty much have to do it by DNA markers. Then they take advantage when there's estuarine circulation, that is fresh water coming over salt, and they sometimes move up in the water column if there's a salt gradient, a vertical salt gradient when the tide is rising, and they move down when the tide is falling, and that allows oysters to be, the larvae to be retained within estuaries. There are a lot of places like Jamaica Bay where there's a lot of vertical mixing and there is no salt gradient and they can't tell at all, but there are places in Chesapeake Bay and other types of places like New York Harbor where this is bound to be a very effective way to keep larvae within the estuary. And there are a lot of other species that do this as well, this taking advantage of the tide to be able to not be washed out to sea. And after 2 weeks, the larvae move near the bottom and they settle in sluggish areas. And then there are these little things called spat. You can see the hand for scale. And then they start growing. They cement down and they grow. And the larvae feed with phytoplankton with the help of a ciliated band. And the larvae are mostly lost from any one spot. There's a scientist in Virginia, Elizabeth North, who's been working on this mostly with doing physical modeling. She's a combination biologist but physical oceanographer, and she's been using the behavior of larvae combined with the physics of motion to predict where larvae go. And the story is that some places they might be retained, but a lot of them are lost. They move all over the place of the bay. It depends where their release is as to where they're going to wind up. Sometimes most of them are retained. Usually they're not. Usually most of them are lost. So that's so much for reproduction. Now a little bit about feeding. And I think you all know that oysters suck. They use millions of cilia on a gill to drive water into a mantle cavity. They feed on phytoplankton, all sorts of different cells that are usually never much bigger than 10 microns in size. There is this gill. It's kind of a lousy picture, but you can see this gill, which is really very lovely. And I'm going to go past that and show you just how that an oyster gill is very complicated. And we're going to go inside an oyster using a thing called an endoscope. Some of you who have hair as gray as me know exactly what an endoscope is. This one is made out of glass. I don't think you want one of those. And you can see there the gill is plicated. Stuff has been caught. You can see like snow caught on the gill, brought down, transported to this particular tract. And there's another tract here, and this is where the particles that go in this tract here You can see them moving rather rapidly. They're caught and stuck down there, going this track. Those are going to be eaten. This stuff on the other side, what's called the ventral side of the gill, are enmeshed in mucus and they're rejected. They're now coming to a structure called the palp, which transports it either away and they get dropped right on the bottom and rejected, or they go in another direction and they get eaten by the oyster. And because the oyster can move stuff in different directions, by the way, this structure is very unusual in bivalves. It's really special to oysters. They can rapidly sort good particles from bad particles. Here's an experiment where we fed them ground organic material that isn't very digestible with a red flagellated cell. They were in equal numbers, and this is what it looked like when it came out. One side was red, the stuff that they rejected was brown. I could show you all the counts, but believe me, it's a remarkably high selectivity that oysters can do. They can select good food out of their environment. And one of the things that's been noted is that dense oyster populations, at least by calculation, and if we had more time, and we don't, because I only feel like I have 15 more minutes to talk with you, and I hope that's enough, that's okay with you that I'll do that much. Oysters can be calculated to have strong effects on estuaries. A calculation that's been made by Dr. Roger Newell of the University of Maryland at Horn Point is that oysters in the 19th century cleared out Chesapeake Bay in 3 to 6 days. I'll have to tell you that that number is controversial. I don't believe it. Many people do, many people don't, for a whole bunch of reasons that have to do with estimating the rate of oyster feeding and also the physical oceanography of Chesapeake Bay. But he's got to be right that they have a very strong effect on very shallow water columns, smaller tributaries. For that, I think he's absolutely right, and he should be given a lot of credit for making this point. It really changed the way people started thinking about the value of oysters. In a place like Chesapeake Bay, one of the services they produce of clarifying the water and allowing, for example, things like eelgrass to grow, now the estimated turnaround time is greater than, that oysters turn over the water is greater than 250 days. It tells you something. It tells you that they're so rare they're not sucking anymore. To say oysters suck in Chesapeake Bay is just wrong. They don't affect it very much anymore. They're a non-entity in Chesapeake Bay. They're everywhere, but they don't have the same impact they once had 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. So now here's kind of the ugly end of this brief introduction to natural history, and that's death. They have a lot of predators, and it's particularly, I was told not to move, they are, especially in open marine salinities, very strongly affected by starfish, also by snails called oyster drills, and there's some other predators as well. You go down to Chesapeake Bay, the salinity is usually too low for a lot of these things to be there. When you see a lot of starfish taken up in an old photograph, you know it's a picture from New England or from around here. It's not from Chesapeake Bay. Here the salinity is high, and probably the influxes of predators were a major factor when the great hurricane in 1938 broke through a bar and brought in saline water. That contributed to the demise of the oyster, a very important factor. Nobody quantified it very well, but everybody believes that this is what happened. There also are diseases, particularly two organisms that are amoeba-like that invade oysters, one of which came transported by the Japanese oyster, Crassostrea gigas, Latin names again, and but also another one called dermo, which has been moving steadily northward over the last 50 years and is now as far north as Boston. As warming occurs, regional warming occurs, global warming occurs, disease is going to get worse and worse. But on the other end, very low salinity is a problem, and low oxygen is a problem. And here are a summary. I think I've mentioned a couple of these, but not all of them. What oysters do, they make a habitat for other species. In shallow creeks, they can clear the water of algae. I'm not going to buy the major effect of the whole of Chesapeake Bay, but I do believe it's an important factor. Something I haven't mentioned, and that is that they can take stuff out of the water. deposited on the bottom, and if it stays there, it doesn't get eroded away, the nitrogen will get processed and released eventually into the atmosphere by a process called denitrification. And then if you harvest them, you could remove oysters if they're harvested. And if I ever get to the end of this talk, and I swear I will, you'll see an example of this. Okay?